Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight on this lovely Friday evening in our webinar titled Discussing Orang Laut Advocacy. The time is 8:01. We'll let our viewers stream in and we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. This webinar is streamed on both Facebook and YouTube, so you can tune in to either one of these platforms to watch this stream, whichever you prefer. See you in 5 minutes. To those of you streaming in now, we'll be starting in about a minute. Hi, good evening, everyone. It's been a very rainy and gloomy day, but thank you again for being here tonight at our webinar titled Discussing Orang Laut Advocacy in Singapore. It is 8:05, so we'll be starting our webinar now. This webinar is streamed on both Facebook and YouTube live, so you can tune in to either one of these platforms to watch this stream. You can go to RIMA Facebook or YouTube Facebook, or you can find these links on our link tree on our Instagram page. But before we begin, let me just give you a little bit more preface on what we're doing with this webinar. This is the second installment in our webinar series on advocacy that aims to look at the practices of advocacy in Singapore. In the previous one, we looked at advocacy in the Malay language and literature space, and we heard about the experiences and a little bit of history with regard to the different phases of Malay language and literature advocacy. Today, though, we will be hearing more about the Orang Laut advocacy and keeping in mind the objectives that we have for this series. Firstly, we wanted to recognize pioneering advocacy efforts in the Orang Laut space. And with this comes discussing experiences, challenges when advocating. And we also want to find out the different outcomes that we want to achieve with these advocacy efforts. And lastly, we also want to find out what makes effective Orang Laut advocacy in Singaporean context. Actually, what we mainly aim to achieve with this series is also to provide a platform for our audience to connect with our speakers, be it advocates or academics, because the questions that have been asked in our previous webinars has been very telling of the kind of responses and support that we actually have in the community over these issues. And it is very encouraging that we are engaging with these issues lah. So actually, why are we discussing Orang Laut today? This advocacy space with regard to the Orang Laut and the indigenous communities in Singapore is actually steadily growing and in various creative ways. We see collectives or individuals being very active both offline and online. And there has been a lot of encouraging support for these efforts. And I think one that comes to mind other than Orang Laut SG, whom we have today, that's unique to me is Get Hooked SG that started by Nur Huda Saad, who is an Orang Laut descendant. She aims to allow Singaporeans to experience the sea and hear stories about the places and islands that they pass by through organized boat tours. And also, I do think that the Orang Laut space is unique in a sense that this advocacy space is very intertwined with other discourse like culture, environment, displacement, or even historical preservation. So in a bit, we'll be hearing more from our guest speakers. We'll have our academic perspective from Dr. Vivienne, who will be giving us a little bit of context, a little bit of history on the Orang Laut in this region, and then we'll be dialoguing with Firdaus, who will be sharing more about his collective, Orang Laut SG. And we'll end this session with a Q&A where you'll be able to send in your questions. But at any point in the webinar, actually, you can send in your questions via the Slido. The QR code is on the top right-hand corner of your screen, or go to slido.com and key in the numbers underneath the QR code, or you can go to the comment section of either Facebook or YouTube where you are streaming from and ask the questions. Without further ado, to formally introduce our first speaker, Dr. Vivienne. She is an anthropologist who has done extensive field research in Singapore and Indonesia. She has particular expertise on the ethnohistories of communities self-identified as Melayu in the Riau Archipelago, and on top of that, she has written on Pulau Seking and Orang Suku Laut. She obtained her PhD in anthropology from the Australian National University, Masters in Social Sciences from University of Singapore, and bachelor's degrees in music and anthropology from the University of Minnesota. And she has taught in various universities as well. Very wide accolades. But let's now invite Dr. Vivienne to help us build some historical capacity with regards to the Orang Laut. Dr. Vivienne, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. This evening, I want to discuss Orang Laut indigenes in the past 1,000 years. So you might think 7,000 years is a long time, isn't it? But before 7,000 years ago, there was no Singapore island. There was only Sundaland. And what you write that I have for you is Sundaland, 17,000 years ago. So all the gray areas are the areas that were joined up. And it goes all the way to Taiwan. So that's why the Australians don't walk across. And can you see? So at that time, the sea was 120 meters below what it is at present. And Singapore Island, the Malay Peninsula, the Riau Lingga Islands, Sumatra, Borneo, Java, all the of Indonesia, all set on the Sunda Shelf, which is the world's second largest continental shelf. The sea, the sea rose and fell several times. This slide shows Sundaland 17,000, 11,000 years ago. I'm not very conversant with this. The sea level was rising, and it was 50 meters below what it is at present. So you can see parts of Sunda land were lost to the sea. But Singapore Island still did not exist as an island. In fact, island Southeast Asia did not exist. Was created only 7,000 years ago. So if you think that island Southeast Asia is a fact of life, it's not. It was only a creation of the rising sea 7,000 years ago, and the sea level then was 10 meters below what it is at present. So Singapore Island is a mountain that was left unsubmerged by the sea. The sea only submerged the lower slopes, and left the island as an island. So you cannot take the island as a fact of life, because life changes. Okay, there have been many land reclamations here. So far the land reclamations are quite easy to do, because what is being reclaimed are the slopes of a submerged mountain. What we see here are three kinds of boats. So when the sea rose and the coastline was double, because previously the lands were connected, and then so suddenly they became islands. So you see here on the left hand side is a raft, and the raft is used even up to the 1970s by the Orang Asli on the Malay Peninsula. And then the second one is the coracle, which is made of woven basketry, and it is still used in Vietnam. The third one is when there is a dugout canoe, and this is found all over the world. So it's not strange that the Orang Laut use the dugout canoes. So the people using these boats foraged off resource and sea. They did not take from nature more than what they needed. So no fridges. This is environmentally important, because we cannot take from nature more than what we need if we are to continue living on this planet. Here we see three current clusters of foragers who are sea people: the Moken, the Orang Laut, and the Sama Bajau. So the Moken live to the west of the Orang Laut, and they are found in Burma mostly. And then you have the Orang Laut, who are in Singapore, the Riau Lingga Islands, and the east coast of Sumatra. Then you have the Sama Bajau, who are the ones in green, and they are scattered all over in Sulawesi and other islands to the south. But what is unique about the Orang Laut is that they were part of the state. They were integrated into the state from the 7th century onwards. We know this from the Undang-Undang Malacca, which is the laws of Malacca, from the Kingdom of Malacca, dating from the 15th century until it was conquered by the Portuguese in 1511. The Orang Laut were known as Hamba Raja, slaves of the king, and therefore they were under his protection. And they were commanded to settle on land rather than to be boat dwellers roaming the sea. So you find that there are Orang Laut who are settled on land even today. Now, Singapore has has had a kingdom even before Malacca was founded in 1400. In the 14th century, there was a kingdom at Bukit Larangan, better known as Fort Canning, in our island, which is a mountaintop. Uh, and this kingdom is discussed in this book, 700 Years. This book is by Kwa Chong Guan and his co-authors. And one of the co-authors is Tan Tai Yong, who is the president of Singapore University for Social Sciences. So it's no big secret, okay, because this is a, a well publicized fact. So this Temasek kingdom was part of a network. It was part of a network of autonomous port cities seeking to derive profit from the seaborne trade. And where was this seaborne trade conducted? It was conducted between China and the countries of the west of China, namely Europe, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent. The Temasek kingdom possibly existed even before the 14th century. I'm going to see whether I can move this down. Uh, this is a stone inscription. It's called the Kedukan Bukit stone inscription. It's the oldest old Malay inscription and is dated to the year 683. So Srivijaya and its autonomous port cities coexisted with Tang Dynasty China during the years 618 to 907. So in the 11th century, the network of autonomous port cities disintegrated after raids by the Chola Empire. But the autonomous port cities, such as the port city in Temasek, continue to profit from the seaborne trade. Now, this is quite an important point that I want to make now, which is that Srivijaya and its port cities, and in the port cities continued even without Srivijaya, could enter the seaborne trade only because they obtain various products from the Orang Laut. So we have examples of this. For example, there is tortoise shell from the Pulau Tujuh in the Riau Lingga Islands, which was given in tribute to China. And in 1178, it is recorded by the Chinese of the Song dynasty that tribute from Sumatra to China comprised 113 tiles of pearls. Now, where do pearls come from? Pearl comes from the shellfish or an oyster. A coral tree weighing 240 tiles, 13 big pearl rings, and 40 tiles of corals. Now, these are all natural products. They are not farmed, they are not, mined. They were collected by the Orang Laut who could dive in deep waters. And even today, Orang Laut can dive in deep waters. Now, after the Song dynasty in China was the Ming dynasty. Between them, there was the Yuan dynasty. But in the Ming dynasty, which was in 1405 to 1433, the Ming dynasty took a lot of interest in China. That is the first and third Ming emperors. So they sent Admiral Zheng He, who is called Admiral Ching Ho, if but he's in Chinese writing, he's Zheng He, to Southeast Asia, and this is a statue of him in Malacca. And his squadrons were more than 300 ships. He came in 7 naval expeditions. However, And this is an interesting part. Other Ming emperors did not favor the seaborne trade, and no expedition was sent. So their lack of interest cleared the way for the Europeans to come in. The European colonization of Southeast Asia happened only because the Chinese became this uninterested in Southeast Asia. So a long time before 1819, we had already a lot of developments in which the Orang Laut played a part, happening in Southeast Asia, especially including Singapore. So the European powers came to Southeast Asia, and first the traders came. Then in the 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish traders came in search of spices. Later on, the British and the Dutch became prominent, but only from the 17th century onwards. So usually when you study history of Singapore, uh, in schools, you start with 1819. But a lot happened before 1819. So when 1819 happened, let's have a look at 1819. The treaty was signed between the English East India Company and the Mongol Abdul Rahman and his preferred Long. I say preferred Sultan because at the time, for a while, there was no Sultan of the Johor Riau Kingdom. And this treaty gave uh, the permission of the Temenggung and the quote unquote Sultan for a British trading post to be set up in their country. It was not a treaty giving territorial cession. All three signatories, and what I show in the slide is the treaty, facsimile of the treaty. And all three signatories, as you can see, who have signed here, are legal equals. And as John Crawford, the second British resident, said, the native chief was considered to be proprietor of the land, even within the boundary, unquote. At that time, Singapore was part of Perintah Temenggung, which is the Temenggung's domain, which included Singapore, Batam, Galang, and the smaller islands. When the 1819 treaty was signed, about 1,000 of the Temenggung's followers were present. According to the record of the meeting, there were 500 Orang Kalang, 200 Orang Seletar, 150 Orang Kelam, and other Orang Laut, presumably Orang Selat, as the term Selat refers to inhabitants of Singapore's southern islands. Only about 20 to 30 Malays were present. The document recording the 1819 meeting regarded these people as the indigenous inhabitants of Singapore, but they were not necessarily land dwelling. Some of them were boat dwelling, and they were dwelling on the sea and the land of Singapore. As shown in the British 1820 map, so 1820 is just 1 year after 1819, place names which are used are Orang Laut names. These names include Jurong, Ulu Pandan, Rochor, Bukit Timah, Kalang, Tampines, Changi, Tanjung Ru, and Kranji. So these names are well documented, and these names have not changed. The Orang Laut remained as the Temengong's followers until the 20th century. When I did my research in Singapore's Southern Islands in 1980, specifically, respondents there told me about boat races organized by the Temengong's descendants who are now sultans of Johor. So what happened after 1819? In 5 years later, in 1824, the English East India Company, which was a private company, and the Dutch signed the Anglo-Dutch Treaty in London to resolve their disputes and to prevent any future dispute. The treaty demarcated two spheres of influence. The Malay Peninsula, Singapore, and northern Borneo were to be ruled by the English East India Company, while the islands that became the Dutch East Indies were to be ruled by the Dutch. The successors of the British and the Dutch are Malaysia and Singapore on the one hand, and Indonesia on the other. After the Anglo-Dutch Treaty was signed, the English East India Company then signed the Treaty of Friendship and Alliance, which is the treaty for the cession of Singapore with Temenggong Ibrahim and quote-unquote Sultan Hussein Shah. Incidentally, he didn't become a proper sultan because he didn't get the royal regalia, which was taken by force by the Dutch. So that's the story of how the land of Singapore got ceded to the British. So as the British Straits Settlement, Singapore became the Republic of Singapore in 1965. But actually, this line that you see on the map, which I have shown, is the line between the British and the Dutch. So this line became the international boundary between Singapore and Indonesia. When we go to sea, we don't see these lines. These lines only exist in maps. So to be indigenous in Singapore is to be indigenous not just to the land, but to the 7,000-year past that precedes the 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty. And as I have shown, the past between 1824 is much longer than the past between and what follows. So we know that Singapore was not an empty land since at least the 14th century, when there was a Temasek Kingdom, there was a port city, and that may have existed as Srivijaya's network. In that past, the sea and the coast of Singapore Island was part of a larger territory that included that included Sumatra and the Riau Lingga Islands. In fact, in the 19th century, the Dutch regarded Singapore as part of the Riau Lingga Islands. It took the 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty for them to agree to change their view. At the moment, the climate crisis is eroding the coast. In Papua New Guinea, in the last few years, 30,000 to 40,000 people have moved inland due to the rising sea, and some have moved to mountain tops. But Singapore is already a mountain top, so can we actually go further inland? The Republic of Singapore has many descendants who are from others, and they are citizens who are born and brought up here. Now, interestingly, they may not want to go back to their ancestors' home. They feel like strangers when they are in the homes of their ancestors, as they may no longer speak with their ancestors and they are not familiar with the way of life there. So, this is a process of indigenization. They acknowledge the presence of those who precede them as the indigenous ancestors. At the same time, they recognize that Singapore is their home. That's all I have to say.
Okay. Thank you,
Now
Dr.
you
Vivienne,
turn.
for sharing. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vivienne, for sharing the various Orang Laut narratives from a historical perspective that we don't really usually hear. Yeah. And today I learned so many other place names, Orang Laut names, like you said, Jurong, Changi. And I think another takeaway is that Singapore has not been an empty land since the 14th century. Yeah. A reminder to all our participants, if at any point in time in the presentation that you have any burning questions, do make use of the QR code at the top right-hand corner of the screen to access our Slido or our comment section, and we'll keep them for the Q&A session at the end. Thank you, Dr. Vivienne. Now we're moving on to our next speaker. Just some background. We have Firdaus Sani. He is a fourth generation Orang Laut Pulau descendant, and he founded Orang Laut SG in 2020 to preserve the heritage of Pulau Semakau. He advocates for indigenous voices, representation in education, and public discourse. And he delivered a TEDx youth talk on sustainability and participated in the Singapore's Writers' Festival and performed his work at Esplanade Theatre. And he's recognized by Honeycombers as one of Singapore's local legends and featured in prestigious magazines 40 Under 40, and has some experience in the non-profit sector such as WWF Singapore. And he also founded the Black Sampan, a social enterprise that supports local non-profits in their fundraising and social impact goals. So let's now have Firdaus to share with us a little bit more about his collective, Orang Laut SG, before we dive into a short dialogue. Firdaus, please.
Thank you, Izati. And thank you so much, Dr. Vivienne, for that wealth of knowledge. You guys can hear me, right? All good? Okay. So my name is Firdaus. I am from Orang Laut SG. And today we'll be sharing about what we are doing at Orang Laut SG. It's a collective that has been ongoing since 2020. So we are working with a lot of other descendants from the Southern Islands specifically, and we use multiple ways to preserve our heritage and also talk about the things that we do, such as educational programs, outreach, arts and culture as well. And maybe just a short history about my family. We used to live on this island called Pulau Semakau, and this island today is a landfill. And these individuals were moved in the year specifically 1977. And when my grandparents left the island of Pulau Semakau, they returned to the island again because my grandfather said that the city's air wasn't for him and he wanted to move back to the island. And at the same time, that's where his livelihood were. That's why he convinced my grandmother to live on Pulau Semakau up to the 90s. And because of his quote unquote defiance, I was able to experience island culture with him. And it's also because of the connections that we still have in Riau as well, where our families, our extended families, are still situated at. So we would do yearly visitations to just reconnect to our roots and support them in any ways that we could. Yeah. So some of the works that we do is we try to focus on the impacts of relocation. How our advocacy started. This also because this is something that is very dear to me. I know the community members, and I know the kind of individuals that are around and has been around, and these individuals face multiple hardships as well. And I think what we try to do is to focus on these 5 key points, which is when we lose a space, we also lose culture, traditions, livelihoods, and also at the same time, we try to acknowledge that there are still impacts while relocations happened more than 40 years ago. These individuals and their descendants are still living in areas that are poverty stricken, and they face social economic impacts as well. And other than that, there's also the adjustment of identities when they adapted to mainland Singapore and readjust the identities as Malays. And these individuals also, are still around. Some of them have passed on, unfortunately. I think that's why we are against time, whereby what we try to do at Orang Laut SG is also to make sure that we're able to document narratives as much as possible. And other than that, we also try to establish that there are heritage spaces. We want to make sure that we're able to recognize the indigenous communities around, and we try to bring them forward as well. Yeah, so our goals are what I've mentioned earlier as well. Acknowledge that Sikh communities being impacted, recognize and share lost narratives, and recognize the sea as a living space to practice our island traditions. And we wanted to also share that there are a lot of importance, including indigenous voices in policy making, when it especially come to land and sea development, because individuals have always been adapting to nature and environment for the longest time, as what Dr. Vivienne has shared earlier. And also looking into what we want to do is using education as one of the tools to really advocate for our goals. So some of the work that we do is we started as an Instagram page. When we first started in 2020, we actually use food as the main way to actually share our traditions and livelihoods. And also because food is something that is widely accepted in Singapore. So from then on, we built on 2 other pillars, which is art and stories. And that's why we started working with more community members. And we also started documenting life on Pulau Semakau first, because this is something that I know, because my community members are still around. People like my mom, my aunt, my uncles who used to live on Pulau Semakau are able to give me access to their livelihoods, and also to their past experiences. So in the photo on the left, that's actually me. This is taken in 1990 when the jetty of Pulau Semakau was still there. And this is half the jetty actually. It's not the full jetty. And in the 90s, what we would do is a lot of the Southern Islanders would still return to their homeland or ancestral land. So, for example, my grandmother would actually bring us to Pulau Semakau alongside my mom, my aunts, to just make sure that we still have access to the island traditions. Yeah. So some of the works that we do is we document oral history, and what we do is we acknowledge that sometimes the things that people within our community would not share, especially to outsiders or to researchers. So sometimes it becomes a family knowledge. So that's why we try to document it as much as possible. This could look into the knowledge of spirituality, mantras, which mostly are kept within families as well. And it's also because of the stigmas that this kind of narratives are being shunned aside within the community as to be un-Islamic. So the things we do also involve tours, talks, and discourse. So we work with schools a lot. We do learning journeys. The main goal is to push for our narrative to be part of national education. So I've been doing it for a couple of years. And what I mentioned earlier, we use food as a way to talk about our stories, and this is how we started. And right now, when we do events that are pertaining to our culture, there's always the food element, whereby we wanted to shape what our community's food is. And this is a photo of one of the descendants from Pulau Sudong, Kak Asinda Daud. She's a very talented veteran artist. And this is one of the very first performances that she has worked with me on, whereby we look into weaving the knowledge of mantras into poetry. And so far, we've been working together on a couple of projects. One of which is we involve other community members. This is Cik Hamzah who and his son, whereby we brought the technique of weaving boo traps onto the stage of Esplanade and to be part of the performance as well. Yeah. And we also work on a bit of advocacy efforts whereby we wanted to push for more indigenous narrative when it comes to land and sea developments. So this has been a slow but strong effort. I'll share more later about what we have done. And we also have established a space for us. It's called Tanah dan Air, which means land and water. So this space is an important one because what we wanted to really establish is that there is a lot of interconnectedness between land and sea and our traditions. So in this space, we do a lot of workshops, programs, and also learning journeys. But the plants that we are planting focuses more on three main themes, which is food, culture, and also beliefs as well. Sorry, medicine. Yeah. And why we chose to have that space at West Coast Park is also because there's a still active community at West Coast Park. This is one of the only remaining ones where a lot of the community members that came from the southern islands, specifically Pulau Semakau, Sudong, Sekijang, etc., are still there. They are still docking their boats there, practicing their island traditions, weaving boo traps, and what they have been doing has been constant. They still rely on their on fishing and other ways of maritime craft to sustain themselves. This could be supplementary or could be their main source of income. So what we try to do is to recognize this space as a heritage space. As you may know, West Coast Park used to be a long stretch of beach, but right now we're only left with that tiny space that is the beach of West Coast Park. And other than that, we work with other community members such as the Orang Seletar through art and other advocacy programs as well. This is part of AIR, where we spoke to some members of the Orang Seletar to talk about the impacts of development and what's happening to their community just across the causeway. And our main focus right now is we are focusing on the Greater Southern Waterfront Project. And if you look into the yellow areas, right, these areas are basically 10 kilometers of coastal promenade, whereby at the very end, there might be an inclusion of development when it comes to West Coast Park. So our worries is that when it comes to development, our community space might change, and we want as important stakeholders of the community, we want to be able to share their challenges and their needs and their wants. Make sure that we're able to preserve this space when it comes to development. So what we have been doing so far is that we have spoken to the Ministry of National Development, such as Mr. Desmond Lee, who has been, helping us to achieve our goals. I think what we try to do is, it's a long-term effort whereby we got in the community members to open up and share some of their challenges, especially at the community space. And what we hope to do is to be the bridge between the community and also government leaders to make sure that, some of these challenges, such as social economic challenges that have been impacted to them for generations, could be addressed. And at the same time, when it comes to developing areas at land or at sea, these voices and narratives could be included. We need to include that there are knowledge that are actually still important, indigenous knowledge that can only be shared through years and years of being at sea. And other than that, we also really try to advocate for our narrative to be shared on a greater front. So recently been working with other communities such as the Orang Laut in Bintan and also the Bajau Laut in Sulawesi as well, and where they actually signed a declaration between three countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and also Philippines. Yeah. And I think in terms of urban development, we are trying to identify markers, but at the same time acknowledge that there are indigenous names that could be recognized, that are important to the community as well. And what we actively try to push for is that there are plants, there are areas that are still significant to the community that could still be used as markers and to be used as reference for our culture and our community. So recently, we got two questions into Parliament with the help of our committee members and also MP Sharil Taha. So we got two questions in where it focuses more on like the Orang Kalang and also the Orang Selat, which is on the Southern Islands. What we wanted to focus on is that when it comes to the development of the Kalang Alive project and the Greater Southern Waterfront project, how can our narrative still be included? So what we did was we worked with these MPs, and when the questions came in, we actually formed working groups, and we also invited the minister to come in and to talk about and some of the plans so that the committee is also in the know, and also at the same time the leaders could hear from the committee themselves some of the challenges and some of the issues that they're currently facing, and their worries as well. So our landmark event next year, sorry, this year is going to be Hari Orang Pulau. This is where we are trying to bring together all the islanders in Singapore. So Singapore used to have seven islands. What we try to do is to bring about this narrative through workshops, programs, panel discussions, and performances as well, such as a Joget Dangkong that is still predominantly being practiced in the Riau and islands as well. So a lot of our southern islanders will still go to Riau just to have this communal dance when there's weddings, when there's other celebrations as well. Yeah, so this is just a start of having a community event together. But of course, what we hope to do is to really push for more representation, and eventually, what we hope to do is to establish a heritage center or indigenous center that could be hosted at West Coast Park, so that people can learn about our culture, and our culture doesn't remain in just museums, but having these spaces, more community spaces such as West Coast Park is also important. We want to make sure that these communities can thrive, and our descendants um, can still be practicing, and also encourage the younger descendants to practice the island traditions as well. Yeah. So yeah, I know I have like 10 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. If you want to follow us on socials, we have our socials here. Yeah, let's be friends. If you guys don't know, you haven't followed us yet.
Okay. Yeah. So nice to see how something that started off using food as a vehicle to share narratives has evolved into something so much bigger. Yeah. Yeah. So let's head into our dialogue session where I just want to know a little bit more about your advocacy efforts. So I just wanted to you to elaborate a bit more about how you've got to different places and regions with various academics, if I'm not wrong, to gather narratives from Orang Laut in the region, right? And I'm very intrigued by this. Could you tell us more about your experiences with visiting different tribes, and what are your larger aims with that?
I think I have been fortunate to be invited into these learning journeys, and for me, it wasn't just an invitation, but it's also to understand other cultures, whether or not there's similarities, whether or not there are differences. So, for example, we went to Bintan, where we visited the Orang Sekolah in Panglong. And through that, there was an invitation through NTUCCA, through Professor Utamatabao. And, of course, they were doing their own dissertation and project. And I think for me is to really understand what are the differences or similarities within our culture. So it was an eye-opening one, because there's a lot of intersections in terms of belief systems, spirituality, and we eventually became friends. And these communities are still in my WhatsApp inbox. We're still chatting. It became like a support system of sorts, whereby we could actually share challenges and also the hopes and inspirations, because these are individuals within very similar spaces and livelihoods. And recently we've been invited to Sulawesi. This is through the Ministry of Culture in Indonesia, and that is where they invited different groups of Orang Samabajau, the Samabajau people, whereby they signed a declaration to actually push for intangible cultural heritage in the UN. So that was the very first time they do so. And that during that 3 days of dialogue, there were conversations about identities, whether or not, there are differences, and also naming conventions, sharing of food, recognizing food as a way to recognize traditions. And what really struck the most to me was that they recognize mantras as a way to shape their traditions. And I think specifically that there was something unique to me, because this is something that we're doing in Singapore. So to see that at a larger scale, um, it's quite heartening to see that these efforts are being done elsewhere as well.
Mm. So these are part of your documentation efforts. Will they be compiled somewhere, or what's your bigger aim when you are documenting all these?
Okay. I think for the Sama Bajau, I think this is more of like my learning experiences,
Mm.
not really documentation per se. But of course, through social media, we try to push as much as possible. In a way, we are documenting, we are sharing what other groups and indigenous groups are doing. I think that's important to us. But at the same time, for me personally, I'm currently working on a book. Been working for a couple of years now, whereby it actually documents my late grandfather as a community member. He's actually quite a prominent figure. So basically, the books follows him as a person from Pulau Semakau, and who he married from Pulau Sekijang, which is my late grandmother, which is Pulau Sekijang, St. John's Island. And from then on, we will be interviewing more community members that leads to other southern islands and also the Riau Islands as well, where a lot of community members are still there. Yeah. So we also have embarked on a research project, or a personal research project, whereby we would visit spaces like Pulau Sarang, Pulau Terong in Riau, where we interview people who knew my late grandfather. So this is part of the documentation process, whereby we hope to compile it in the book, to shape who he was, who he knew, and the kind of communities and livelihoods that they used to have.
That sounds very nice. Looking forward to when the book is published, whenever that is. Yeah. Uh, I also like that you recognize that this whole endeavor cannot work in silo, and you've also worked with a lot of other islanders on various advocacy efforts. And I'm sure that their ways of advocacy are unique to themselves as well. Are there any advocates in this particular advocacy space that inspire you? And what have you learned from them?
Okay. I think that's an interesting question, because I feel that Dr. Vivienne Wee has been an advocate since the start already. So I think we owe it to her to make ways for us to push for more indigenous narrative. And I think looking into some book writers as well, um, you know the book on Orang Selita. I think that was an important one. Sorry, I forgot the title, the back of my head. Um, and I think it was written in, I believe, in the 90s, where not a lot of indigenous narrative are being shared widely. And also, some of the pioneers would include Kak Sena Daud, who has been doing it for quite a while as well, who uses and music as a way to share indigenous narrative. And as an advocate of Malay language, I think she uses and weave a lot of our language into education as well. So I think there's a lot of pioneers and people have been doing it. So for me, I'm just doing it for 5 years, and I know there's still a lot of things to learn. There's a lot of people to collaborate with, and in terms of like what's important to me now is the community voices. So because, like what I said, we are against time. I think a lot of this narrative that I'm sharing or I've gathered is through the community. So through the programs that we do right now, if you look at our programs, there's more inclusion of community members, more inclusion of them being present, sharing their narrative, and make sure that they are also confident in their narrative, accepting it, reclaiming it. And I think that has always been our strategy, making sure that their voices and their presence are being felt. So it cannot be a one man show. That's why we are opening this um, responsibility, I would say, to my team. We also have volunteers who are becoming advocates, which is fantastic. And we also work with content partners as well. So, for example, Continentalists who have co-written a piece with us through data and research. And I think all of these things come with a lot of um, hand holding, a lot of like collaboration with wider community networks. Yeah, so I think it cannot happen alone. Lah. So we recognize their momentums. We also recognize that there are also younger generation, within the Orang Pulau community who are slowly accepting the identities or getting recognized as well. And for example, we had a student who did a research on uh, her grandmother, and her grandmother happened to come from Pulau Bukom, and that's where she started to be interested in island culture and her traditions, and from then on, she slowly became an advocate for us and her culture as well. So I think it's more of like reclaiming identities, reclaiming um, who they are and who they were as well. So I think we are also breaking away from the idea of CMIO. Um,
Mm.
Right, the Malays, it's actually not only just Malays, there's also other subgroups that are still around. I think it's more of like looking into whether or not we are able to encourage and champion this. And slowly we are, seeing more and more individuals who are advocating for these causes.
Mm. Okay, this sounds very encouraging. But I'm sure when you meet with various advocates from even outside of this advocacy space, you would discover that they also face similar challenges when advocating. Could you share more on some of these like constraints or challenges that you face?
Personally, for me, is it?
Mm, yep.
Okay.
What are some of the similar challenges that you face with the various advocates that you are connecting with?
Mm, I think some of the challenges that maybe I could remember at this point would be um, really trying to locate, because individuals are hard to locate because we have to do a lot of groundwork, and sometimes our work is, we're very busy, we were not able to reach out to more and more people, and these people are not around anymore or has dementia or do not want to open up. So some of the challenges we face is that they just do not want to recognize. We met a couple of individuals who came from a specific island who just want to share because they want to erase that part of their identity. um, and the kind of like social stigma is real, because people like, within my family as well, she would say that aku bukan orang pulau, aku bukan orang laut, aku orang Singapura. Like I'm not orang
Mm,
pulau,
mm,
I'm Singapura. Even though she was born on the island, she was raised,
mm,
but because she came to the island when she was young, and she became a teenager in Laut Singapore, so she felt the discrimination because of the way they speak, the differences in language, more dialects really, and belief systems, etc. So, and also how these communities always seem to be lesser,
mm,
have been belittled in the sense that they are poorer, living in poorer estates, and because of their socioeconomic backgrounds as well, they are looked upon. They're not really looked upon. Lah. Um, so because of that, there is that rejection of the identity. So I think what would be the main challenges is, you know, um, really getting them to share the narratives. Yeah.
mm. Okay. Um, you've done so much good work since you started in 2020, but have you identified a change in community perception? And what are some positive developments that you've seen with the advocacy that you do?
I think in terms of positive perception would be people are starting to ask. Uh, it's a good and bad thing. I think people are saying, asking, oh, there are a lot of indigenous, but what about the Malays? Are they indigenous? So
Mm,
it became actually a kind of worms, because they will start to ask if the Laut are not indigenous, then that mean the Malay are not indigenous. It's also a bad thing for the Malays because the Malays have been indigenous to the region, right?
mm, mm,
And I think that's where people start to question. But then it opens up a dialogue, lah.
mm,
A dialogue of like, who are the individuals who are indigenous, but also the idea of indigenous equates to whether or not you have indigenous rights, which is almost non-existent. But then what are we fighting for? So I think it's all the kind of recognition is great. We can see an uptick of individuals who are recognizing this. This is through media acknowledgement, through the acknowledgement of peers and people that may started to follow us on social as well. I think there's also a very strong interest in terms of research lah.
Mm,
Also, it brings about some problems because when it comes to research, these individuals would mostly some of the students are they are undergrads, which comes with really positive intentions to just learn about the community, but at the same time, um, we also need to establish ethics, ethics of research, whereby these need to be cemented in Singapore. I don't think there's any ethics when it comes to engaging indigenous communities. So anyone can
mm,
just come, take your knowledge, take it for research, and go. And I think that's not the ideal way of working with communities such as the Orang Laut communities in Singapore, because
mm,
they're vulnerable. And also the question why. And so we also built like a set of ground rules when it comes to research. We need to understand who does it benefit, how does it benefit the community, and
mm,
how the community be supported. And when it comes to research, how can this narrative support the communities in future? Yeah, so
mm,
we are working on a guideline with a researcher from the University of Hawaii. We launched this year, so where we look into like how can indigenous communities, be respected, they acknowledge, uh, they're being acknowledged as um, knowledge giver providers, and they are able to be seen as the same caliber as the academic, for example, because these individuals have a lot of cultural value and capital, which they do not recognize. So I think through us, what we do is also we try to tell them that you need to understand that your narrative are very important. It carries weight, it carries value. You cannot just be, accepting any single request because it's your time. Sometimes they bring out to the sea and then they don't, pay for their fuel and their time. And these people are, they're not the kind of person who would ask for, in a way, money lah. These individuals would just do it out of goodwill. Yeah, but at the same time, it poses an issue in terms of ethics because can we make sure that the vulnerable communities are being protected for the time, for the knowledge, for the efforts? Yeah, so I think we are building this set of guidelines, which we hope to share with the wider community in Singapore.
mm. I think you talked about this in your Substack. It's called, the title is called "You Come, You Take, You Leave." You talked about knowledge extraction, and I thought that was a very interesting piece because, yeah, like you said, there is the need for ethics when we are also gathering knowledge. That is all the time we have for this particular dialogue. But let's move to our Q&A segment where you are able to engage with both Firdaus and Dr. Vivienne Wee. Um, yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of questions streaming in into the Slido. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can scan the QR code on the screen. Mm, our first question is for Dr. Vivienne. Hi, Dr. Vivienne. Thanks for the
Yes.
informative presentation. I'm wondering if there are cultural elements of Orang Laut that are visible or still practiced in modern Singapore today.
Well, the memories of life on the southern islands is very important. And in fact, in Geylang, there is a commemoration of Laksa Siglap
Mm,
sold in the Malay store. And this Laksa Siglap cooked by the Orang Kalang in Siglap. And people from far away still go to to Geylang to go and eat the laksa siglap.
mm,
So definitely there is cultural memories and uh, um, um, cultural traits that are still uh, recognized, and definitely skills like making the boo boo trap, are skills that should be continued.
Mm. Okay. Um, there's another question for you, Dr. Vivienne. Could we ask if your research and knowledge is published or documented somewhere, and are there plans to make this more accessible to the public or to inform education?
Oh, actually, my research is going to be published as a book, Melayu People Place by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies.
Mm.
Uh, and the research is based on the Rio Linga Islands rather than Singapore, but it's interconnected. Singapore and the Rio Linga Islands are part of the Temengung's domain in the past, and it should be uh, these connections should be valued.
Mm. Okay, so we can look forward to a book.
Yeah, yeah. The book is coming out in
Okay, nice.
2026.
So there's two books to look forward to. Okay. Um, and there's another question, quite interesting. I think it's also a question that I've always been curious about with regards to terms that we use to refer to our indigenous community. Um, yeah, terms
Mm.
are important because they shape our mental categorizations and associations of groups of people. So I just want to know, is there a difference between Orang Laut and Orang Pulau? Yeah, the question is open to the floor.
Oh, historical term. So from the
Mm,
14th century onwards, this term crops up all the time. We don't see Orang Pulau as a term that is in historical documents.
okay. So Orang Laut is a historical term, but
Yeah.
now we use Orang Pulau, or is it interchangeable?
Orang Pulau implies that they are settled down, but they are not settled necessarily land dwelling.
Okay.
I was with boat dwellers from Batam, and
Mm,
they shift between Batam and Bintan easily, and they don't see themselves as Orang Pulau.
mm,
Yeah, I think to just add on to Dr. Vivian Wee's point is that when it comes to identification, we would refer to ourselves as like Orang Pulau Semakau because that's where they settled. So a lot of these communities, of the Southern Islands specifically, they would call themselves Orang Pulau Seking, Orang Pulau Sekijang, etc. Yeah, so it's just to mark where they are from, where they're currently inhabiting. Lah. But also, we need to acknowledge that there's a lot of intermarriages within these islands as well.
mm,
That's why,
Yeah, yeah, and there was a point I made just now that the Hamba Raja, who were the slaves of the king and who were under the king's protection, commanded to settle down. So the people who settle on land may be regarded as a link to Temasek and Malacca because they were Hamba Raja.
mm. Okay.
Mm.
Um, Thank you for the clarification on Orang Pulau and Orang Laut. That was insightful. I hope that the audience now know what's the difference. Okay, we have a few questions on practices and rituals in the contemporary times. Question to Firdaus: do the Orang Laut still carry out activities at the sea? And also, are there any community members who are still practicing rituals such as buang ancak?
um, I think looking at the practices, just maritime practices, there are still an active community member, a handful of them that are still based in West Coast Park. So these communities, if you look into just the Bubu weavers, we are left with about 9 or 10 individuals only. This is where they would share with a lot of our descendants on how to create bubus and also to practice bubu fishing. When and these are also active fishermen who are still going out at sea that came from Pulau Sudong, Pulau Semakau. People like my brother who have access to boats, he will still practice it, and he works in the maritime space. But in terms of spirituality, I think that's something that has drastically stopped, in recent times, and this is also because of the adaptation of um, Islam in mainland lah. So I think these kind of practices are not widely accepted within the community, the larger community. So I think even talking about it, they would not want to acknowledge it. So I don't think there's practicing community members. So that's why what we try to do in terms of documentation is that to acknowledge that these could be seen as an art form because some of the mantras that have been written, right, there's a lot of reference to ecology and the words that they've used are no longer being used now. So I think what we're trying to do is to not to encourage using of it, but it's more about documenting that these were, livelihoods or rather like practices of the past that could be seen as art forms. Yeah.
Okay, so reframing it into an art form. Okay, um, there's a question for both speakers. Speaking about educating the future generations, how effective would it be to include some unknown parts of Orang Laut history in social studies textbooks?
Well, definitely the school curriculum should look at the past that precedes 1819
Okay.
because we have a long history. So the book 700 Years of Singapore history was written by notables in Singapore, Fa Chong Guan and his co-authors, and it was supported by the Singapore Bicentennial Office and the National Library Board. Why is this a secret? In fact, this should be part of the advocacy because when we acknowledge that there is a past that precedes the 1819 and 1824, this is not a big deal. So we proudly acknowledge that. So I support having a heritage a museum center in West Coast Park.
Thank you, Dr. Vivian. Maybe just to add on, I think it is important also like to in a way decolonize our social studies textbooks. I think we need to look into way past 1819. And also, the Seven Islanders narrative is part of the Singapore's identity as well. I think it's time that we recognize that.
Mm.
Okay, so there's a lot of improvement to be made to social studies textbooks. That one we all agree. Okay, we have so many questions on our Slido. Okay, there's a question on indigenous communities. Wait. The Australians acknowledge indigenous communities, give acknowledgements of First Island nations, and have a designated minister to safeguard the interests of these communities. To what extent do the goals of Orang Laut SG align with practices in countries like Australia?
That is a good and tricky question because we need to understand like the political climate of our country, and it's also quite contentious because it is something that while we want to acknowledge our history and acknowledge like our traditions and culture, but at the same time, are we pushing for indigenous rights? I think that is something that someone has asked us. Are we pushing for indigenous rights? But what does indigenous rights look like at this point when a lot of these communities are assimilated within the Singapore uh, culture and city? And I think I feel that if that were to happen, if it should happen long ago, I think we're a bit late to acknowledge that. And I think the Australian model, if you compare the population size, it's rightly so that they push for indigenous rights because there's still quite a vast number of indigenous people and descendants. But in Singapore, I think I would say we are one of the minorities, and I do, and also it would come into I would foresee possible issues whereby we are tracing back roots and to look into who are the indigenous people. So I think it's a model that we could refer to but not follow, note by note. That's my take. But it's also understanding what the community wants and needs, because the community asks are actually very simple. They just want more heritage spaces. They want to be able to continue livelihoods. They want to go at sea. They don't to have restrictions on water. They want to have their voices being heard. They are and also supported when it comes to any sort of like land improvements within the community space. So I think our asks are not a lot. It's actually quite basic, and I think it's more of like whether or not we are able to work with the government leaders on the kind of asks that they want.
Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. So sorry for the technical difficulty. I'm here now. Okay, there's another question on, with reference from Malay annals, how much of the Orang Laut's cultural symbolism is of loyalty, adaptability, and maritime expertise are still visible and practiced? You know,
Dr. Vivienne Wee, do you want to chime in? You
Actually, the Sulawatu Salatin, which is the Malay Annals, was written as a court document in the 17th century. And as I mentioned before, some of the Orang Laut, but only some of them were Hamba Raja, slaves of the king. But not all of them were slaves of the king. Uh, and the question is adaptability. I think definitely the maritime expertise was there, and even now is there. So that definitely is still there, is still continuing. But loyalty is loyalty to whom and to what? As I mentioned in my last slide, many citizens in Singapore or in the Republic of Singapore are indigenizing. They recognize that they have no home but in Singapore. So, in the process of recognizing this and as as their only home, um, it's a kind of loyalty, and so this question of loyalty should be asked of the indigenous and the indigenizing, and definitely they are adaptable because they have adapted from the southern islands to the HDB flats, and then they have adapted. So adaptability is definitely there.
Maybe to touch on that as well, maybe I would refer to the conversations that I had with the Orang Seletar. I think they are still based in Johor, and these people were made to, you know, settle. They used to be boat dwellers, and I think only in recent times they have embraced Islam, and there's also some of them was because of social pressures. I think, but they still have the core values, which is to make sure that they're able to practice the maritime traditions. They're still speaking their corn language, which is actually fast diluting a lot of the community members who have settled, then adapted into Malaysia's education system. They started to not acknowledge the corn language. I think and I think that their asks are very simple. They want to make sure that they could still preserve and also maintain their identities. And sometimes when they marry, it's also because of what the state could offer them in terms of healthcare, education. But the idea of marriage to them is different. The idea of marriage is just um, a couple just being together, and that's the idea of marriage. They do not have a ceremony, but they always talk about we need to have the surat nikah so that you have access to all of these perks in a way.
Thank Thank you for both those perspectives, one from history and one more contemporary. I think that was quite insightful. A question for Firdaus. Could you say more about how you are documenting oral histories? Is it a systemic set of questions relating to key themes of interest or more unstructured stories or narratives? This person is wondering how the methods of collecting histories determines what gets preserved.
We have a set of questions, but because you don't know who you're gonna meet, sometimes this set of questions really, go haywire. They will talk about every single thing. So for us, it's a bit unstructured in a sense. But I think that's the beauty of it also because we are able to get different narratives. And I think it's also because we are from the community, we're able to just talk and get knowledge as much as possible. So sometimes when we talk about plants that are culturally significant, we could branch it out to like you know practicing practices of birth, practices of death, how they view certain community groups that actually came to the southern islands, such as the Bugis, etc. So I think different individuals would have different set of narratives, and I think having it structured would not do us any good because then we are not able to document as much as possible. But of course, we are not in a way academics. We are community researchers. We want to make sure that we're able to just get as much narrative that usually not be shared when researchers who would impose a certain kind of like you know stature. So there's always this hierarchy system when researchers come into a community space. So we try to eliminate that because we're not researchers, we're just people from the community. And it maybe sometimes also is very subtle that oh the researcher comes in, then you have to be proper, you have to share a certain narrative that is in a way just how they want it to be seen. But I think what we try to document is the little nuance as much as possible. So we always do a video recording, and we just during the interview there's always a lot of laughter. So I don't know whether this could be part of like the national archives, but I think it's this for the community, and we try to document as much as possible in terms of stories.
Yep, I think authenticity in that sense is quite important. There's another research question. Uh, a lot of intellectuals, I guess, in our midst. Do you think community-based participatory research training is important and needed, especially among Orang Laut advocates and activists?
I would the simple answer is yes. We definitely need so, and I think this is not only would be beneficial for researchers, but I think the kind of ethics that or guidelines right could be implemented in other communities as well. Yeah, I think this is more of like the value system is just respect. Respect people as knowledge providers, and whether or not we're encouraging into that space. We don't see that a lot. So, but because this is based on our past very terrible experiences with media companies, with researchers who come and just take and go. So one example is they want one media company who is foreign. I think they were foreign companies. They wanted to document our community members, and because they wanted a boat or sampan from the community space, they wanted just like that. It's like, can we just do this sometimes? No, you need to make sure that you're able to move your time because these people are working as well. You need to take off, do it on their leave day, etc. And I think they also would discuss, oh, how much will it cost? And they would negotiate the price, but they are very willing to pay more for a drone shot that costs like $300 an hour, but they're not willing to support the community, which I think is very, very baffling. So that's why this comes from so many bad experiences that we say we need to be able to come up with a guideline because they are getting used by researchers or documentaries so many times they're not even aware. I think that's why I feel like that is really important. It could be a guideline, but also we are also hoping to push for more workshops, whereby we can look into how can communities be respected, the ethics as well. This is coming from a community's perspective. Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Yep.
Actually, if you look at the genealogies of the Malay community in Singapore, you might find that there are many indigenous roots, because the migrants who came from Java, from Bawean, from Sumatra, they were mostly men, and they married Melayu women. So, who were the Melayu in Singapore at the time? So, if you look at the early census in Singapore, in fact, the census mentions the Orang Kala and all that. So, if we really uncover the genealogies of the Malay community in Singapore, you will find that there are many indigenous roots. It's not just the Orang Laut with indigenous roots.
Since we are at that topic, there is a question for Dr. Wee. What are some of the most annoying misperceptions of Singapore's history that you encounter these days?
Well, Singapore history. I'm very glad that the book 700 Years was written, but we need to pay attention to that because we have shortchanged ourselves. We have shortchanged ourselves by not looking at the context of the the, in which we were in. We only concentrated on 1819 and 1824, and 1819 was not a treaty of cession, it was only 1824. 1824, the Anglo-Dutch treaty was the important treaty. So even that was is not given enough analysis. So we need a more in-depth analysis of the indigeneity in Singapore. And then I also mentioned the indigenizing. Uh, so there are people who are from China, from elsewhere, but from India. So where do they fit into this? So therefore, they have to be indigenizing rather than indigenous. And in fact, this is not unique because in Tanjung Pinang, in the Riau Lingga Islands, there are many Javanese who don't speak Javanese anymore. There are many Bugis who don't speak Bugis anymore, and so on. And they want to consider themselves as a Malayu.
Okay, thank you so much for enlightening us. You heard it here from an academic about the various definitions of what Melayu is. Okay, we have time for one more question since it is approaching 9:30. The question is open to both of you. What can the general public do to help your cause?
Firdaus, you want to talk about this?
Okay. I think yeah, this question is not an easy one because there's so many ways you guys can help us. But I'm gonna maybe do a small promotion. One is to if you want to support our community, there are many ways. One of which is to be part of Hari Orang Pulau. That's something that we're pushing out in June. This is a free event that is partially supported by NHP, and currently what we are doing is also to do a bit of fundraising because we did the calculations and pushing an event for 1 to 2 days outdoors is really costly, is stupidly costly. And what we hope to do is to look out for sponsored individual donors in any way, shape, or form to make sure that we are able to have that one day dedicated to our community. And also, this is not only a day to celebrate our livelihoods and traditions, but it's also a day where there are opportunities for research. What we're trying to do is to collect as many data as possible what we want to do is to start to do a bit of culture mapping to see where their descendants, whether or not these individuals are living in poverty still, whether or not we can measure at the impacts of displacement. I think that's a larger goal, and there's a lot of research opportunities that we can do beyond Hari Orang Pulau. Yeah, so I think that's one of the ways you guys can support us through supporting Hari Orang Pulau.
And Dr. Vivienne, any input on that?
Well, I support whatever Firdaus is saying for his community. I think more research needs to be done, um, like real research, like tracing genealogies of families, and not just just lumping people together just because they happen to be called Malay. But looking at the history and the genealogy, and definitely I support the advocacy of um, Orang Laut SG in seeking support for the conservation of West Coast Park, which is the only uh, remnant left of life on the Southern Islands. But beyond life on the Southern Islands, there were more orang the asal in Singapore. There were indigenous people in Singapore, like the Orang Seletar. They helped Parameswara to escape from the attack via Seletar. This is documented in Sulalatu Salatin.
Okay. There's a follow-up question from me. Where can we start if we want to learn more about the Orang Laut? Like, are there any academics that you would suggest other than Dr. Vivienne Wee, of course?
I suggest that you do research on your own family. If you do your research on both the father and the mother side and their parents and their grandparents, you'll find that there are indigenous roots. There are indigenous roots. It's not just single-sided.
Okay. Firdaus, any input on that?
I maybe in a more contemporary context, I always refer to the book Fisher-Bennett Flats that documents the resettlement of the Orang Sudong, the Pulau Sudong. I think that's a good start. And of course, Dr. Vivienne Wee's work and Dr. Cynthia Chow as well. And I think from there you can branch out and look into, like, there's also other researchers within the region that actually focuses more on, like, coastal communities. And maybe also you could look into the Sama Bajau research as well. There's actually quite a lot that has been written.
Okay. That is the end of our Q&A. Actually, the webinar is also ending. That's all the time that we have today. If you could help us fill up the feedback form on our, the QR code is here. And links to our socials is here. Yeah, so you can follow Orang Laut SG on Instagram. Do you have any other social links, Firdaus? Other than Instagram?
Hey, we have Facebook as well. We have TikTok, but not very active. Yeah, this few.
Okay. Yep. That's the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for all your insights, Firdaus and Dr. Vivienne Wee. We hope to collaborate again on another webinar in the future. And maybe we'll see each other at Hari Orang Pulau when it...
Yes. It's going to be in June this year.
Okay. Yeah, just keep a lookout on Orang Laut SG Instagram. I think they're quite active. I'm enjoying the content there.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stay for a bit for people to scan the feedback form. Give it. Maybe on some background music. The feedback form will also be sent on our Instagram, so just keep a lookout on that. We'll end the stream in